Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jen Baldwin with Virginia Tech TTAC, and joining me today are
Sue Schultz.
And Helen Barrier. The number one key to any good professional development we know is that everyone shares a common language and has a clear definition about what it is that we're talking about. So we wanted to start off right away with the definition of what is SDI, because it's something that we talk about a lot in schools and you talk about with your teachers. In the video, George Bash says that it's instruction that reduces or eliminates the barriers related to the disability. We've lifted the definition from IDEA wording and put that here on the slide. And what's important to know about specially designed instruction is it really means just adapting the content, the methodology, or the delivery instruction that is going to address the unique needs of the student and ensure their access to the general ed curriculum. So those are the kind of the three big ideas we've included here, because that's super, super important as we are talking to teachers and we're talking to administrators and parents about what we're doing with SDI in school. What we do know about SDI is that it has to be evidence-based practices, whether it's a program or whether it's a practice. The SDI needs to be directly connected to the learner characteristics, as it says here, addressing the unique needs of the child, and that we have to give them access and it's aligned with their grade level standards. So we'll be talking a lot about that as we go through information and material that you can share with your staff as you're providing this professional development. And when you think about yourself as an administrator, you're doing walkthroughs and supporting the learning of all your students. You need to ensure that it is tied to Tier 1, and Jen's already mentioned that, and that is extremely important. So it really, when you're listening to that video, you probably picked up on it. George Bash tells us that good Tier 1 instruction has to be there, and how it is directly tied to post-secondary outcomes and the success of our special ed students in the classroom. That SDI cannot actually counteract poor Tier 1 instruction. So it's really, really important, and that's something that we all gleaned from him as we dove a little bit more into learning more about SDI. He further shares that everybody's involved in this process of providing specially designed instruction, because it has to be focused on Tier 1 and it has to be integrated into the other tiers 2 and 3. So that takes us to the graphic on the right-hand side, which kind of looks like a science experiment with a lot of pieces in there. And it actually is, because we have to first think about what are those learner characteristics, what are their strengths, what are their areas of growth, what's keeping them from learning, what are their deficits, is it visual perception, is it attention, is it memory? And then we have to think about that explicit instruction there in the center. What explicit instruction are we going to be able to provide to scaffold them into becoming and learning to be independent learners in the curriculum? What evidence-based instruction am I going to incorporate into my Tier 1 instruction and offer these students as specially designed instruction? And then lastly, what am I going to do about intensive instruction? Sue's going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but that is something where we have to think about, do I need to increase the intensity? Do I need to cut back on my steps? Do I need to provide more prompts? Do I need to offer this in a small group instruction or one-on-one instruction? So there's a lot that goes into providing good SDI. And that is all tied into this definition. What we want to really crystallize with everyone now and take a deeper dive into SDI is, how do we ensure that they do have access to their grade level content? And just some highlights of what's in here. What we know SDI is number one, it's in addition to their Tier 1, to that core instruction, that it's based on their learner characteristics, that it's individualized, that it's focused on their independence, and it has high expectations, and it maintains that in the gen ed setting wherever possible. So those are really good, clear things about what SDI is. But what we know that it's not in place of their core instruction. It isn't a placement. It isn't just reteaching. And we have a special ed director who likes to say, it isn't just closer and louder. It's more than that. It isn't watering down the curriculum, and it isn't trying to give them so many supports that they'll never be independent. We're never promoting that dependence. So there's some really good points of discussion in here, and the document that is linked at the bottom of this slide is actually from the Kansas State Department.
So now we're ready to talk about the first HLP that really supports SDI, and it's explicit instruction. And I just want to note that the words explicit instruction on this slide, as well as in the notes, link to the HLP site where you can watch a video and get more information about explicit instruction. But we think it's important that you know that this is the most extensively researched practice, not just for students with disabilities, but for students without disabilities. So it should be in your tier 1 as well as your other tiers of instruction, because it is just good teaching. We found this graphic and we just added to it a little bit because it really helps show the progression of explicit instruction. It starts with modeling by the teacher. And this is all about teacher behaviors and how they conduct their lesson. So our outcome is we want to reduce any cognitive confusion for the students. We want to make sure that they clearly understand the expectations and whatever the skill or concept is that they're working on. So we start with that teacher modeling and doing think alouds. That's the I do part. Then there's going to be this gradual release of responsibility. We don't just have students hop into doing independent practice. We're going to be in the we do phase where we have guided practice. And this is where they'll get multiple opportunities to try the skill or concept, and they're going to get that constructive feedback that's going to help them really make sure that they know and understand what it is that they're doing. And then after we know that they've got a handle on it, that's when we'll move into that independent stage, the you do part. It's really important that we don't skip that we do part. I think sometimes teachers they will go from modeling it straight to independent practice. That gradual release is going to be so crucial. In the notes, we'd like you to know that there is a link to a video that demonstrates an explicit instruction lesson. And there's also a link to William & Mary's Learning Links, where they have like photographs demonstrating a lesson. And I think that's about it for explicit instruction. This is going to be the backbone, though, to make sure your SDI is delivered. We're going to help students have errorless learning by making sure they've seen clear models, practice them with guidance, and then move to independence. So the teacher's going to have to do a lot of planning to make sure that they've created that logical sequence of instruction for students. In addition to explicit instruction, we may find we need to use intensive instruction. This is an HLP as well. So the words intensive instruction will take you to the HLP site. There's also a link in the notes. This is where we're providing the highest level of support for students. They're in tier 1, they've had an evidence-based practice, they're getting SDI in tier 1 as well, but for whatever reason, they're still struggling. This student needs more. That's when we're going to move to intensive instruction. It's used to address academics and behavior. You don't just have to use intensive instruction for academics. So we're going to target what are those set of skills that this student is struggling with. We're going to clearly articulate what the high priority skills are that we want them to understand. This is called data-based individualization. And that's where on the graphic, if you look in the middle where it says diagnostic data, that's where we're going to really look at what is the barrier for this student? What are they struggling with? And then we're going to take our evidence-based practice and we're going to beef it up. We're either going to change it or we're going to modify it. And we're going to reduce the group size that this student is learning these skills in. And by reducing group size for intensive instruction, it's a tier 3 service. That means we're going to have one-on-one instruction, maybe 2 or 3 students. there's going to be a specialist delivering this, whether it's a special ed teacher, reading specialist, math specialist. And they're going to use explicit instruction, give the student more opportunities to learn and get constructive feedback, because we know students with disabilities need 10 to 30 times more practice to really gain a skill. During this time, the teacher's going to use think alouds, manipulatives, visuals, all those extra things that really help bring concepts and skills to the concrete level. And after we check how this progress monitor again and see how this student is doing, if they're starting to have success, we want to gradually fade away that level of support. We don't want to have students stay in intensive instruction all the time. So the goal is really analyze, figure out what they need, deliver the instruction explicitly, and then start to back off.
Awesome.
All right. This next graphic, we were very happy to find. We had lots of discussions around how does this all fit together. I think it's really important to see that the HLPs really help deliver effective SDI. So I think that's really key to understand, is how do they all fit together, work together, and that explicit instruction being that really important way to deliver that instruction for our special education students. And then, as Sue just described, that intensive instruction. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how important it is to be on the same page about the definition for all of this and what the expectations around all of these are, not only in your school and you as the leader making sure that that's clear for your staff, but for you as the leader to make sure you have conversations with your special education directors to really know what are the expectations around these in our division. How do I make sure that that's made clear in our schools? And this is a great visual. So I think it's a good place when you're thinking about doing these activities with your staff to stop and have conversations around it. I think it's really helpful. It's from an article, Big Ideas in Special Education. There are so many good pieces of information. They talk through all of these areas and how they work together. It's a great article that we suggest you stop and look at and read. And I'll share a little piece of it with you in a moment. But I also want to emphasize that as a general education teacher, I really would have loved to have seen this graphic. I would have loved to have talked about this in a faculty meeting with my administrator, with my special education teacher that I co-taught with. I think it would have really helped me understand number one, how does all this work together, but also what's my role in all this. I would have really felt I had a better understanding of how to be an active part of this with my students, because they're my students as well. So I think that's an important conversation to have with your staff. I'm going to share with you that little piece that sort of sums up, it's on page 2 of the article with you. But again, we encourage you to stop and take a look at the whole article. And it says, in sum, SDI is a broad term that specifies the type of instruction students with disabilities should receive. SDI is created by changing instructional content, methods, or delivery to meet the student's unique needs as a result of a disability. SDI should support students with disabilities access to the general curriculum while meeting the goals and objectives outlined within individualized education programs. Thus, SDI is the product of identifying the goals and objectives of intervention, and by definition is individualized and will look different for students with different strengths, needs, and abilities. HLPs, EIs, or explicit instruction, and intensive instruction are all aspects of SDI. So we think that's just a really, really good summary statement. Sue and Helen, anything you want to add to that?
I just want to reiterate what you said, how important this diagram was for me, because we were struggling to think of how all these pieces fit together, because they tend to get used interchangeably sometimes. And I think this kind of shows why they get used interchangeably. You can see that they are really interconnected and rely on each other.
All right.
And getting that common vocabulary. That's awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think us being us, we took it and made it a little bit of our own graphic as well. We borrowed this originally from William and Mary TTAC, but we thought it was really important to, in addition to looking at how you use those high leverage practices to really implement effective SDI, and really all of the HLPs play a really important role in that. But we wanted to emphasize, since we're really focused in on instruction, that you really should be using explicit instruction on that social, emotional, behavioral side. Anybody who's worked with students knows that it's important to teach that skill deficit for behavior, just like you would for an academic or reading deficit, and to really use explicit instruction and intensive instruction to teach and reteach a skill that might be missing. So we thought it really important to stop and really emphasize that. And I think it's a good place for you as the leader in the building to talk about what that looks like in your building. What are your expectations around that? Whether it be whole school or in that classroom, definitely for that individual student. What are the expectations when we're talking about those behavioral skill deficits? And how do they overlap with the academic skill deficits? It's very difficult to pull those two apart. And I think it's really important to have conversations about how those two sometimes are working together, and how do we make sure that we're explicitly teaching around both of those when that's needed. So we encourage you, stop, have that conversation, and know what those expectations are for you and for your staff in your building. Sue and Helen, anything to add?
Well, Sue has already shared with us the definition and some videos that would be appropriate to talk about with instruction under high leverage practices. There's a video for explicit instruction, there's a video for intensive instruction. In the notes of this slide, you'll notice that we added a link to a video on explicit instruction with social skills. And it comes from the Real Co-Teachers of Virginia site, and it's HLP number 9, Teaching a Social Skill, which you can access, but you'll note that you have to create a free account to access the materials off that Real Co-Teachers of Virginia site. But this short video, and it's only a 3-minute video, you'll see that it's a kindergarten class, and the students are being taught explicit social skills. And along with that, they're being given feedback, they're being given prompts, and then finally how they generalize that skill into not only that class, but all of the classes that the students go into. And they have used social stories, and they use writing activities, and they've got a bulletin board up there to prompt the kids for regulation. So it's a really good another example, but really pulling in this idea that Jen has just brought in and done a great job of how important it is to teach those social, emotional, and behavioral skills through explicit and sometimes intensive instruction.
Okay, now we get to one of my favorite graphics. This tree, I think, really shows what George Batch was talking about in the introduction video. It starts with universal design for learning. UDL is for all students. It's where we're designing our instruction and our curriculum, thinking about the learner variability in our room. We know that classrooms do not have all typical learners in there. We've got kids who have different strengths and weaknesses. So with universal design for learning, we're really thinking about that ahead of time and thinking of where all different kids might struggle, and then planning how to help them overcome those barriers. How can we use their strengths to help them overcome what might be difficult for them? The way we do this is by differentiating our instruction. And I think it's important to note that differentiated instruction is not a program, it's not anything like that. It's a way of thinking. It's how we provide different opportunities, different tasks, different ways for kids to learn instruction. We don't just hand them worksheets and think everyone can learn from that worksheet. We really try to think of the different ways they might need to access. And again, this is all students. Next is that specially designed instruction layer. And this is where we're no longer thinking about all students. We really are thinking about specific students and what their disability is and what are the characteristics of that student based on that disability. And we're going to really make sure that they can access the general ed curriculum by designing the instruction to have different strategy instruction. Maybe they're going to require some assistive technology or some equipment they need. And then, of course, the accommodations and modifications that we're all mostly familiar with. I think that's what most people think of when they think of SDI. But we can't leave off those strategy instruction, because if all those students needed was accommodations and modifications, they probably wouldn't have an IEP. We could just have a 504 plan in place for them. So I think that's important to note, that we've got to think of all those things when we get to that specially designed instruction. A way to think of this is, let's go back down to universal design for learning. We may have graphic organizers that we're using in our instruction because they're great tools, and we know it's a great way for kids to organize information and to make sure they can understand and, study from it. But if I know a student in my room has a disability that impacts their ability to organize information or remember information, I'm going to specifically make sure they get explicit instruction on how to build that graphic organizer, how to use it to help them study. And that's what makes it different. That's what brings it into SDI instead of just a universal design for everyone. I also would like you to note that on the side here, it says a focus on inclusion conference interview with Marilyn Friend. It's just a great 5-minute video where she really gives a great definition for what SDI is and how it's different than differentiation. So it's important to note, once we're talking about SDI, and Helen mentioned this earlier, it's above and beyond that tier 1 is what everyone else is getting in tier 1. It's the extra supports that student needs. Wherever we're delivering it, it's above and beyond what other students are getting. There is also a link to the UDL guidelines on the notes in the previous slide. So on this slide, we're taking a look at what does this mean in Virginia. And that link that says, what does it look like in Virginia, goes to a document that houses this graphic. And we just like it because we think if you look at the top, it really helps show specially designed instruction can happen in any tier. It does not have to be a tier 3 service. So it's important to note on this slide that it says Common Core standards. We just want you to remember that in our state, those are state standards. The difference between SDI and interventions, though, is if a student doesn't have a disability, they can access that evidence-based practice or strategy that we're delivering in tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 1, and they're getting it because they have a gap in learning, and that intervention is going to help them. When we think of a student has a disability, they're going to access that intervention because it meets the need they have based on the characteristics of their disability. So it could be the same program or practice, but the reasoning behind why we're using it might be a little different.